before I start off with this, I suppose I'll give a brief update to the status of Ethereum. So, first of all, Ethereum is going to become a sidechain of Dogecoin.
Just kidding.
Second of all, we're planning on launching fairly soon. So the general process for launch, for those who haven't read the blog, is basically sort of a very long-winded multi-stage thing, where the first step is that we're going to release something called Frontier, which is the scary Wild West version of Ethereum. It's the first actual release where the Ether on the Ethereum blockchain has value. But we warn you, there may be bugs. We will there might be some bad thing might happen inside of the client, and so we might have to restart the chain. And Frontier comes with that warning. And also, we will confirm blocks ourselves every 24 hours. So if at some point you transfer someone Ether, and then we say, oh look, this new block looks okay, then you know if Ether actually got moved. It got moved over. Within that period, who knows what might happen? There might be a fork. We don't know. So we've gone through a whole bunch of security audits. This is an extra step to make sure that everything completely works before we actually release the second stage. And the second stage, which we're calling Homestead, is basically when we actually release the Ethereum Genesis block, so to speak. So the first chain might only last for about a month or so. If we have issues, it might last longer. Second, and then once we're completely satisfied that everything works relatively smoothly and is secure, then we move on to Homestead, and from there, it is the final Ethereum mainnet, or well, not final, but official for some time, and it's running, and you'll be able to do contracts in Frontier, but here you'll be able to have contracts that actually persist for a rather long period of time, and we'll just once every month or so we'll probably keep on delivering some semi-major or major feature. At some point we'll release Mist, at some point we'll release Whisper, at some point Swarm, and so forth. And eventually, ultimately leading up to a launch closer, probably end of this year, beginning of next year, where we switch over to proof of stake. And then things potentially continue. We're looking into scalability and so forth. So it's from then on, it's still fairly unknown how things are going to progress. So in the immediate term, look out for news that says, hey guys, Ethereum is Ethereum's launched, or Ethereum is going to be launching within 7 days or whatever. And as soon as at some point, as we're trying to make it happen as soon as possible, while still releasing something good, Ethereum will come out, and yay, we'll have something close to an actual main network. Ether will actually have value. So this is the other point, which is that Ether that's transferred inside of Frontier will actually be carried over to Homestead. So things that are inside of Frontier are actually valuable. So yeah, and Dogecoin sidechain, right? So I give presentations once every 2 or 3 months or so, where I constantly try to figure out in my head, first of all, what is the whole point of this blockchain and decentralization thing? Where might it become actually valuable? What might its really valuable use cases be? So presentations always end up having their own particular take on the issue. There was one in July, one in October, and one a bit later, a bit earlier, and so forth. And this here, I'm kind of what I'm actually starting to move toward is what I'm calling a long tail perspective of decentralization. So, people are always asking, what is the killer app of the blockchain going to be? And my answer actually basically is that we already had the killer app. The killer app was Silk Road. The point is that we had Silk Road, we had the gambling sites, And all those things are the things that provide really high value to some very specific set of customers. For that very specific set of customers, having decentralized blockchains provides an extremely high amount of value, and without blockchains, they would simply be having a much harder life. And that's why they managed to jump onto Bitcoin so quickly. That's why that particular segment is all into cryptocurrency. So fine. Generally the way economics works is you have diminishing marginal returns. The low-hanging fruit get picked first. Presumably everyone here knows what diminishing marginal returns are. Great. So, so the thing is that the point is that all of the applications where blockchains really, oh my god, change someone's life are basic. If a blockchain application is in that category, chances are it's already been implemented. So going forward, I think what we're actually going to see is we're going to see this sort of long tail. We're going to see this set of applications where blockchains are actually completely not indispensable. So you can do peer-to-peer insurance on a server. You can have hashes signed by manufacturers on a server, and the whole thing would just work completely fine. Blockchains aren't life-changing there, but they do still provide a medium amount of value. So they provide a medium amount of value, and the fact that a blockchain is this kind of open platform where information that gets put on the blockchain is guaranteed to be there forever, and it's guaranteed to be widely distributed and accessible from anywhere in the world. The fact that you can run programs and those programs are guaranteed to continue running for some period of time, and all of these sort of subtler features of a blockchain, each one of them does not have this sort of extremely life-changing effect all by itself, but they add up. And the important thing is, the long tail is where we go from 1 million people to 2 billion people. So, actually, I started working on another presentation on a similar topic a few weeks ago, and then at some point that balloons to like over 80 slides, so I realized that I'd probably have to split it up into maybe 3 or 4 or so. So, this particular one is actually only, probably I'd say medium. It's somewhere in the middle. So for this particular set of arguments that I'm going to talk about here, it's not just about, oh hey, look, here's a much better way of publishing data. It actually, for some cases, it's specifically the fact that something is decentralized actually really matters. And there's also other use cases. There's other sets of arguments as well. So there's this wonderful company called Eris that's taken this very interesting path toward blockchains, where they're saying we don't even care about the decentralized part. You just run the blockchain on a server, and okay, the thing runs on a server. Great. As it turns out, Ethereum's a pretty decent programming environment for some set of use cases. And you could even have blocks in this blockchain just be published. So you have the openness, you have the accountability, but you still have centralized updating. And there might be use cases for that. So, but of course, there's also use cases for a blockchain that actually isn't controlled by anyone in particular. So, so this particular tagline, the story here we really need to decentralize microphones. So the story here is, Primavera Difficulty back in April made this rather provocative article where which was entitled "Ethereum, Freenet or Skynet?" And the question is Ethereum going to create this network that will create a free world, or will it basically lead to the future of machines enslaving us? Whereas the use of Freenet is kind of ironic, since the real Freenet is a sort of very early decentralized internet thing that is so incredibly slow that it takes over a minute to download a website, and because of that, it only gets used for what we'll euphemistically call high-value use cases. So So the idea here is that, as I'll describe, sure, Ethereum could lead to a free network or Skynet, but the way the world is heading right now, you might think of it as being pretty Skynet-y in its own way. So and maybe blockchains will actually be the thing that saves the world from becoming Skynet in some sense. So by the way, just if anyone wants to correct me on this, but I believe the original Skynet as in Terminator was supposed to be a U.S. military project, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. So, see, centralization. Centralization is bad. Right. So first of all, this is the sort of slide where I describe over time I've moved to this sort of Bitcoin could go either way, but blockchains are the really interesting thing stance that seems to be becoming a cliche among just about every venture capital group. And it's a cliche because to some degree it's correct. So Bitcoin is there are high value use cases. For most people, Bitcoin specifically as a product, they're not ideological decentralization advocates. Chances are the modern financial system with PayPal and with credit cards and so forth serves people relatively fine. Sure, if you want to donate to WikiLeaks, and it serves you not so fine. If you want to be on Silk Road, it serves you not so fine. If in some cases, in international trade, it's not so fine. But chances are, the thing that people forget is that the centralized financial system itself is rapidly innovating, and chances are that over the next 10 years, even international bank transfers are going to get substantially better. And users dislike price volatility. They don't like this whole, it goes up by a factor of 4, goes down by a factor of 4, up by 2, down by 2, down by 5,000. No wait, that was Mt. Gox being glitchy, up by 5,000. So chances are, my stance now is that BTC itself is probably not going to be a substantially used unit of account. So things aren't going to be priced in Bitcoin. And the economic rationale behind that is that Bitcoin, the closest thing that you can compare Bitcoin to is probably the gold standard in the 19th century. So, you have a currency, its supply follows a relatively dumb function. And I mean, in the case of the gold standard, actually, gold, it kind of is self-correcting because when the gold price goes up, you can mine more gold. With Bitcoin, well, you can mine more Bitcoin, but the difficulty auto-corrects every 2 weeks. So it doesn't really work. So chances are that, if you actually look at the history of the gold standard, the price went up by 34% a year, down by 10% a year quite often. So it's, as much as people don't like the fact that fiat goes down by 2% every year, going down by exactly exactly between 0 to 5% every year is actually kind of good. So, of course, there is still a reason to hold Bitcoin, which is, well, chances are it might actually replace gold. So gold has a $7 trillion market cap, Bitcoin replaces 10% of it. Let's say there's a 5% chance of this happening. Guess what? Really big amount multiplied by 5% still is a fairly big amount, and it's a decent argument. If there's an even 2% chance that this argument is correct, 17,000 times 2% is 340, price is currently 298. So, but of course, I'm not particularly a cryptocurrency speculator. I'm an armchair economist, and so I prefer to think about more interesting things. So, as I've sort of said on Twitter, blockchains are a freaking database technology. So they're not about the token. The token is just there as a facilitator. It's just a boring industrial thing that has to exist for economic reasons, kind of like software licenses. So, what are blockchains themselves? Blockchains ultimately are they're decentralized databases and they're decentralized computers, and they have a bunch of properties. The two key ones are, first of all, a blockchain is managed by thousands of nodes controlled by thousands of users at the same time. So there's no single point of trust and there's no single point of failure. It's architecturally decentralized, as I've called it, and politically decentralized. So the second property is all the execution is fully transparent, and as long as at least one node is recording the history, all the history is recorded forever. So extremely public data store. And at the same time, it's a decentralized computer, and so you can actually run decentralized services on top of blockchains. And the interesting property here is that, well, once you just push a contract into Ethereum, and this decentralized service starts running, it's guaranteed to execute in a predetermined way for as long as any users care about it. That's a pretty powerful guarantee. So, there's a bunch of services on the internet these days. There's stuff like Remind Me that try to take this niche of, well, reminding you about something in like 1 year or some number of years. Well, what if you want to be reminded of something in 25 years? Remind Me is a startup. If you want stability, are you really going to expect one particular startup to last 25 years? Just spend 30 seconds, write a script on the blockchain, it'll be fine. So, this is one of those examples of those sort of low value but really long tail use cases, right? It's theoretically you can do on a server, but blockchains are just nicer. The fact is, if you're writing a web application and your web application has only a few users, then it's actually cheaper to just throw the whole thing onto a blockchain than to set up your own server. So, once again, sort of long tail, low value use cases, but still ultimately very useful. So, why do blockchains matter? So they matter for a bunch of reasons. Number one, resistance to governmental and corporate censorship. So governmental censorship everyone knows about. Corporate censorship would be something like PayPal blocking Kim.com's Mega, which happened last week. Or all the credit card companies ganging up against WikiLeaks and blockading it as they did in 2010. So Bitcoin actually was a very, I believe even the majority of WikiLeaks' revenue for some very substantial period of time while the blackout was happening. And there's a bunch of use cases that manage to take advantage of this property really nicely. So this, chances are if you're being censored by a democratic government, you may well still be correct, but chances are you're probably going to be a minority. So, and probably same thing for corporations. I mean, they don't want to alienate absolutely everyone. So, small number of users, high value. Next one, blockchain is just an excellent base layer specifically for interoperable ecosystems of services. So if it's just one company that's building one service, then okay, fine, you can put on a server. You might want to put on a blockchain for some reason. It might be better in some cases, but in a lot of cases, it'll be more efficient to just do it on the server. But what if you have company A, and company A wants to have some kind of service operating, and then you have company B, and company B has its own services. And what if those services really need to talk to each other very often, and for some reason they want to talk to each other and they want that interaction to have 100% reliability? So it could be some kind of financial contract ecosystem, could be some kind of sort of if this then that sort of thing. It could be data feeds and insurance or whatever else. Or as another example, provenance is a good example of this. So, here the specific reason why you want to have provenance at all over just, hey, why not just take the fair trade stickers and just put cryptographic signatures onto them so they're a little more trustworthy? And the answer is that you have a network, and ultimately, if let's say fair trade certifies something that's been produced by a manufacturer somewhere, then to some degree that certification really should flow upstream. Like the fact that this particular part of everything down the chain was produced in some fair trade friendly way says something positive about everything that was produced from it. So, and ultimately you're going to have a whole bunch of different certification agencies. You're going to have fair trade. You're going to have organic. You might want to have something for environmental compliance. You might want a whole bunch of private certification agencies, underwriters, laboratories, whatever. So you have multiple sets of manufacturers, multiple layers of manufacturers, multiple layers of these agencies, and ultimately the information from all of them becomes much more useful if it can add up. And if you have all of the data. If Underwriters Laboratories maintains their set of certifications in their place, and some fair trade group maintains their set of certifications in their own place. You don't have that much interoperability. But if you have everything on the same data store, then all the data can be in the same place, it can interoperate, and things can be it allows you to just benefit from a lot more information. Zero upfront cost solution for secure application development. So if you're building an application and you want to be secure, just throw it into a contract. For some reason, Bitcoin websites seem to have a very hard time being secure lately. So, problem is that the issue is that they're dealing with a cryptographic currency, and yet they're still sort of on a separate layer. But if you push the service to the exact same layer, then the interaction between the currency and the service suddenly has 100% reliability. So, that's probably one of the key points here, is that if you have two services, and those two services are executing on the exact same execution environment, then you have 100% reliability for both of them. Now, of course, the reason why in the modern world you often don't have a whole bunch of services executing on the same server is because, well, who gets to run that server? Here, well, guess what? Nobody gets to run the server. It's kind of an elegant solution. Well, it also happens to be a good backbone for finance. So finance seems to be one of those areas where people like not trusting people. Okay. And ultimately, and also the fact that this key points that there are no centralized parties at the base layer. So, this is only one of the reasons why blockchains are valuable. All these other things are valuable too, and even in the kinds of services that Eris is building and the portion of them that don't have the decentralization part at all, they still have all these other benefits. And chances are, if they're more efficient and they're less costly, they might end up being more useful for some use cases. But specifically for the decentralization, valuable by itself. So, first of all, why do we want to sort of decentralize things? And there's definitely a bit of a cult around it. There's this wonderful little meme that's posted on Imager that goes around that's like, yay, decentralize all the things. And then, you got David Johnston running around saying that anything that can't be decentralized will be decentralized or should be decentralized or whatever. Got the decentralization singularity. So, okay, it would be really nice if we could have a decentralization singularity. But the other thing is, well, what if the point is, at the very least, to prevent the centralization singularity? So what I'm going to argue is that a centralization singularity is actually entirely plausible, assuming we fail. So base layers, there's a number of generally in society, there's a number of things that you could call sort of base layer services. They're utilities that just about everything else relies on. So, in the 19th and 20th century, you might think about things like roads, you might think about electricity, police, courts, transportation to some degree, but not completely. I guess transportation would apply more in the context of something like railways. So the properties that these things have is that, first of all, they have very large network effects. So there's just a whole bunch of things that are built on top of them, and there's a whole bunch of things built on top of those things. And each of these ecosystems just gets stronger if more people use them. So, second is high switching costs. So, it's really hard to get a city to completely switch from one set of electrical infrastructure to another set. And it's kind of hard. It's hard to completely swap out legal systems, to completely swap out railway lines, subways, and so forth. And they represent intermediary roles. So in a lot of these cases, like not quite for electricity, but in the case of something like the police and something like the courts, the police and the courts don't produce anything, but they're there to mediate interactions between people who produce things and make it easier for them to produce things without getting screwed by each other. And transportation, to some degree, also an intermediary. The whole point is to help you get from your home to your employer. And so the issue here isn't really so much just the fact that these things are important. So food is important, but I wouldn't really call food a base layer service under this definition. It's more a matter of these things. So in the 19th and 20th century, these kinds of services tended to be managed to a large degree with government involvement. So now let's look at the 21st century. 21st century, what is the equivalent of these? Well, to be honest, I'd actually rather have the internet than roads. Anyone else want to agree with me on that one? Let's see. I mean, if it was possible, I might consider rather having the internet than electricity.
Could we mainly zero, not ones?
Yeah. Internet versus police? So then, of course, on top of the internet, we have things like payment processors and identity services, reputation. I mean, right now we don't really have that good in a reputation ecosystem, but we do have identity services. So, every time you use Gmail to sign into some particular web application of the day, you're using Google as your identity platform. So, sharing economy. So if you look at things like Uber and things like Airbnb, also you might consider them base level utilities on some degree. Like they basically are transportation infrastructure. They heavily benefit from network effects to a large degree. Communications, payment processors are probably so payment processors are the big one. In a lot of these cases, they just end up being managed by basically the first private company that happens to make its way to a monopoly. So, it's, in this case, you got governments managing them. In this case, you got companies managing them, and even if you don't like governments, trusting some randomly selected company isn't exactly a good choice either. And in a lot of cases, it could potentially be even less reliable. So, what is the problem with just having random company A manage some particular service, some particular one of these base layer services, and having basically absolute control over it? Company B having absolute control over your identity and reputation. Company C controlling payments. Company D, basically being the taxi cartel that sets the prices that all the drivers are supposed to charge. Company E building the actual internet that all the other four companies sit on. So, first of all, one issue in general is that services, and this actually applies. This applies to things that are on every level, but on the base layer, it's particularly important. Things disappear. There's this article of 49% of all links cited in Supreme Court decisions are broken. So, guess what? If I write a blog article, chances are 3 years later I'm going to forget about it. And if that blog article is on some blog site and then that blog site shuts down, all the articles on that blog site suddenly stop being accessible. So, it's kind of a hard problem when you have these things that are supposed to be documents that are being referenced by just about everything else. And from a sort of informational standpoint, those documents kind of become really embedded in the sort of informational web. They become almost like very tiny base layer services of their own, and yet they just end up being just on random servers, and those random servers might be controlled by companies that might go offline. So, problem. Second problem, companies can be incompetent. So, this is a rather fun story. There's some random hacker managed to hack into one of the largest certificate authorities in the world. I've kind of forgotten the details, but it ended up actually being really easy for him to get in. And so, once the guy managed to hack the certificate authority, what could he do? Well, he could impersonate a whole bunch of websites. Boom. So, if you talk about Google controlling your identity, what about a guy pretending to be Google controlling your identity? The guy, I believe, is also from Iran. The same wonderful country that wrote that really nice reply letter back to those U.S. Republican senators. So, this is, first of all, one question is, well, why the hell is this certificate authority thing still centralized? So, and you don't even have to be an extremist on this one. You don't even have to say, all all certificate authorities should disappear. We should just replace absolutely everyone with the blockchain. At the very least, require a website or provide the option for a website to be secured by 3 or 5 certificate authorities at the same time. Like, come on. We invented that in Bitcoin land in 2012. So this is the part where companies are incompetent. This is the part where companies are evil. So Twitter started off being extremely developer friendly. Now they're a bit, at one point they made this really big change and they started to be, suddenly became a lot less developer friendly. So Twitter officially announced the changes to version 1.1 of its API. The news is mostly bad. While some new rules are ostensibly obtained at fuzzy good thing, blah, 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 they also severely restrict how much and how often third-party Twitter clients and their services can access Twitter's information. Even worse, Twitter will now require any third-party Twitter application pre-installed on a device to be certified by Twitter. So if Twitter basically is one of these sort of base layer institutions of society, this is how they act. Do you want a base layer institution of society to be controlled by an organization that does things like this? Do you want it to be controlled by an organization, knowing that organization will be doing things like this? So basically, it's a fairly common tactic, it's a sort of bait and switch attack, which is, while you're still a startup, you're supposed to be really nice, you're supposed to get lots and lots of users, you have to attract everyone. Once the network effects flow over to your side, once you're a monopoly, well, you have the incentive to start doing things like this in order to protect your ability to monetize. So, and of course, one of the solutions that we had is, well, to this whole problem of monopoly services is this concept of federation, which is, okay, let's have these centralized providers, but let's try to encourage these centralized providers to follow common protocols. So all these different messaging apps should be using XMPP. Well, problem is, if one of those applications becomes dominant enough, then it just has the incentive to do this embrace, extend, extinguish thing, where it say, oh, we're going to add these wonderful new features that make things better for our clients. Oh, they're incompatible with the open protocol, or screw the open protocol. That's some backwards thing from the 2000s. So, generally, first of all, migrating from one platform to another, as you might know, is hard. If you actually try swapping out your email address to some completely new email address, first of all, you'll have to, people will still end up sending emails to your old email address for half a decade. I mean, I've even set on my old email address, I've actually even set a vacation responder basically saying, this email is no longer valid, please send all future correspondence to v@buterin.com. And even still, people are sending emails to vbuterin@gmail.com. You have to migrate all your contacts over. For anything more specific, you have to migrate all your data over. Chances are you have incompatible formats. If we're talking about some kind of reputation system, then you might end up actually just losing your reputation entirely because all the people you have a reputation with are still on the old platform. There's a whole bunch of these switching costs. And so one of my claims is that by at least 2025, if not now, it'll be harder to change some of your digital platforms than it is to change your country of residence. So we complained about government human rights abuses, and one of the arguments that you might reply is, well, if your government is abusing your human rights, why not switch to a different one? So it might actually become easier to switch to a different government than it'll be to switch to some competitor of Gmail or Facebook or Twitter. So the implication is that users are going to want, and there is going to be demand for services that they know are never going to bait and switch against them. Because the fact is that once you're committing to using one of these platforms, you're basically ending up committing to it for a decade or 2 decades or further. And so you really want to have the assurance that the thing that you've committed to is actually going to remain stable for a really huge period of time. So, the intuition is that basically a lot of these things are essentially new governments, and they need constitutions. So, building a decentralized service is basically the strongest way for an application developer to pre-commit, not to be a jerk, and not to shut down forever. This is, value of Watchchain technology in one slide, done to some extent. So, why do we decentralize? Well, It's easy to decentralize. You just get rid of the evil middleman. Look, you have A and you have B, and they only wants to interact, and you have this evil guy in the middle that's just taking fees. Come on, the guy's obviously evil. He's taking money. He's he's a capitalist leecher. Just get rid of him, and the guys will be happier. Okay, guys, we solved the problem. Meet up over. So Bitcoin, one of the first payment media not to have intermediaries to do those evil, nasty things like chargebacks. You have these evil, nasty things like Butterfly Labs to take advantage of your inability to do a nasty chargeback. Let's have people manage their private keys to their own money. So this is a bunch of really fun examples here. In June 2011, the Bitcoin Talk member All in Vain lost 25,000 BTC, worth $500,000 at the time, now worth 75 million. After, 7.5 million, but still. After an unknown intruder somehow gained access to his computer. Well, how many people would feel safe storing $7.5 million subject to this kind of thing? However, he managed to erase 2 of his keys and forget the password to the 3rd, forever losing access to 7,000 Bitcoins. So, and this was a fairly senior Bitcoin developer. I believe he's either the CTO or something close to that of Ripple right now. I'm pretty dedicated to creating better clients since then. The Java application that the victim had opened had also asked for additional permissions, which the victim instinctively granted, unwittingly giving the malicious program the ability to read all of his keystrokes. Gee, might want to try not typing in your password ever again. Point is, there are reasons why intermediaries exist. So, common example, things like Uber, let's figure out how to decentralize Uber, because as I've said before, right now they're basically a cartel that forces all the drivers to charge the same prices. And as any sane economist knows, cartels are welfare reducing, so therefore they're bad. So, it would be nice if we could decentralize it. Payment processors, banks. So these intermediaries, usually they end up either being there for consumer protection, or they're basically just reputation systems. So if you want to actually properly decentralize these things, then you have to understand that. And you have to understand that they do provide some non-zero value, and they're not just there to leech off of you and become evil plutocrats destroying society. So one option is, how do you actually stop against this? So one proposal is, well, instead of having 1 key to your account, you have 3 keys. Multisig, and you have 3 keys, you need any 2 of them to access your account. It works very well. Ethereum used that solution to store its crowd sale money. And actually, I believe we're actually the only substantial cryptocurrency project, at least at the time, to have we're definitely either the first or the second to have actually used a multi-sig Bitcoin address in order to receive the money for the Ethereum crowd sale. And we did a lot. Like before the crowd sale started, you could actually check that the total percentage of all Bitcoins that were stored in multi-sig addresses was 0.22%. After 2 weeks of the sale running, it was up to 0.40%. Now, people have followed either our lead or some other lead. I don't know correlations, and it doesn't imply causation, and it's at over 6%, so we can all cheer. So 3 keys isn't enough. Potentially, one of the services that all of these some of these centralized intermediaries provide is to basically act as sort of ultimate source of backup. If you forget your key, your password, if you get hacked, if something bad happens, there are humans at the ends that can ultimately, theoretically apply their common sense to solve the problem no matter what happens. Can you decentralize that? Well, yeah, you can. You just have the sort of big 3 out of 8 or 4 or 5 out of 10 or whatever among a whole bunch of people, and theoretically all of these people don't necessarily even need to know each other. Could be your friends, could be your employer, could be some company, could be some government. Doesn't really matter. So, basically the sort of approach of saying, instead of having one provider control everything, let's actually split it up among 5 or 10 of them. Potentially, the advantage that it seems like a bit clunkier, but the advantage that it provides is it provides the ability to achieve a much larger amount of safety more cheaply. So the intuition here is that, if we look at centralized systems in the developing world, in the developed world, in a lot of cases they're pretty safe. But as we know, they cost a huge amount of money, there's very, very higher levels of barriers of entry, they're heavily regulated, and so forth. If we look at stuff in the developing world, there are banks in China there is a bank in China that ran off with like $32 million a few months ago. And there's also like 500 million RMB that just disappeared from people's bank accounts. So, Mt. Goxes do not only exist in Bitcoin land. So, they're a feature of, guess what? In order to have lots of safety, you need to have lots of investment. And if you have this amount of investment, then you have this amount of safety. It's a trade-off curve. But the advantage that event systems provide is they provide the ability for you to get a much, much higher degree of safety at a fairly low cost. Like even if you had, theoretically, I would even say if you had this kind of multisig backup that's like 10 out of 20, and even if those 20 people were random teenagers, I could easily say that that's more secure than some bank. It's a matter of probability. Like banks. Realistically, the banking system is less than 200 years old. It could very easily collapse in the next 200 years. Here, matter of probability, it's a fact. As long as the entire system survives at all, chance of everyone failing at the same time could be like less than 1 in a million. So that's kind of the basic logic behind it. So, reminder for people who criticize Bitcoin for being and cryptocurrency and so forth for having bad security, Mt. Gox is not doing things the correct way. Mt. Gox is a centralized service that tried to hold everyone's Bitcoins for them, and they ended up failing horribly. In part because their CEO did all the work himself and he coded in PHP. So the other thing is that identity and reputation often end up being core barriers to entry in these kinds of services. So all of these intermediaries, they're basically all reputation systems to a large degree. That's quite often the value that they seem to provide over just having everyone do stuff themselves. So if we're actually going to create decentralized versions of services, then currently your identity is managed by Google, and all the data about you, all the reputational data about you, is stuck in a bunch of corporate silos. And so a claim is that decentralizing the concept of identity and moving as much information as possible into an open platform. So, this is sort of the core idea of one of the core results of big data and machine learning and so in general over the past decade has been that it's not so much about what algorithm you use that matters, it's more about just how much information you have. And so the claim is, if we can convince people to pile as much information about their interactions as we can onto an open data store, and I guess what Watchchains just happen to be good data stores. If you really want, you could do it on the server too. Then that would massively reduce the barriers to entry in developing intermediaries. Because why? Well, because the problem with being a reputation intermediary is that if you are a startup, then you are a silo, and you start off having zero information about anything, and so you start off with a very low amount of trustworthiness. And the second problem is you have to go around developing your own algorithms. Here, data is on a public blockchain. A bunch of algorithms are open source, and so the theory is, if your little ride-sharing startup starts off, then you can just plug into existing data and existing algorithms, and you can have a moderately good reputation system starting right from day one. So the intuition is that it's kind of like building a generalized trust layer for the internet. So it seems as though reputation is one of those really important base layer services that a whole bunch of other things on the internet rely on. So in that case, oh, speaking of living without the internet. Continue. Cool. Yeah, sure. So in that Yeah.
Fire it up.
Great. So in that case, actually, can we shut off the electricity? It'll make it a lot quieter. So, given that reputation and identity is such an important base layer, it really does make sense to just sort of do it in a collective manner where everyone benefits from everyone else's work. Is essentially the basic thesis. So, great. I actually don't have a last sentence.
You need some of that.
Oh, perfect. Actually, could I have the laptop? Oh, thanks. Perfect. So first of all, one key point here is that the argument in favor of doing this, the argument in favor of building a generalized trust layer for the internet, is completely logically separable from the case for doing a blockchain. But blockchains if you were going to do the decentralized web of trust thing, then a blockchain just happens to be a good place to put all the data. So, next question is, of course, well, okay, we can build things that are fully decentralized. In some cases, it might be more efficient to build things that are centralized. In some, it actually is quite hard to figure out how to decentralize fair trade. It's not necessarily clear as in, some particular fair trade certification board. It's not necessarily clear that you want to. The simpler thing might just be to say, okay, well, let's just make it easier for people to have a more sort of diverse and competitive market. So we have 5 of these different fair trade groups, and hopefully they all might they all might focus on different things, but between them you have a very accurate view of what's going on. So, is there some way to go down the middle? And the answer basically is yes. So, point of blockchains is not to replace absolutely everything. The point of decentralized technology is not to replace absolutely everything. The point is basically to provide the glue. The point is to provide the stuff in the middle. And theoretically, you could very easily have utilities that plug into blockchains. You could easily have data feeds. You could have services that have APIs, and you could have blockchain-based. If you're going into crypto, this whole concept of crypto law into blockchain, into putting any kind of legal arbitration on the blockchain, you need arbitrators. But the point is, you have a really nice sort of layer that everyone can plug into, and the more people plug into it, then it's like open source; it gets stronger. So I'm basically done. Yes. So So the ultimate
No, we
point.
don't have to go. It's a full salon, but they're trying to show it off.
Yeah. So the ultimate point here is that decentralization is very useful for bottom level services that everyone else depends on. But it's not useful for absolutely everything. But for there's definitely a whole very large set of use cases for which it definitely does provide a medium amount of value. And if we're particularly, there's this sort of separate set of reasons why we want to sort of politically decentralize things to some degree, and in those cases, it just makes sense to have everything be on the same public data store. So, it's ultimately one of the tweets that I probably should have included here, but I didn't, was the one I made yesterday, which is that crypto economic ecosystems are like ogres; they have layers. So, it's all a matter of build. At this point, I think we've barely even started finishing off the first. So I'm really excited to see what ends up being built on top in the future.